Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're picking right back up where we left off with part 2 of Jim Hertzfeld's journey. So picture this. It's September 1944. Jim, a 28-year-old farmer from Northwest Ohio, has just finished crossing the Atlantic. He steps onto the European continent, officially leaving behind the rich, familiar soil of the Maumee Valley for the muddy, completely disorienting reality of a world at war. We're going to track his journey from the moment his boots hit the ground all the way through the brutal realities of the front line.
Okay, let's dive into this. On September 20th, writing from, quote, somewhere in France, Jim sends his very first letter back home to his beloved wife, Georgette, or as he affectionately called her, Teed. Now, he's just traveled across the ocean into a literal war zone. He's eating field rations that, as he casually notes, don't fill one up very much. But what's amazing here is that his entire focus is on protecting his family from worrying about him. He asks about his boys, insists he's doing just fine, and repeats his absolute favorite farming metaphor, keep your end gate up. He's basically managing this massive emotional weight by playing the role of the stoic protector. And even as he's being shuttled through several different countries in this European transit system, Jim literally never stops being a farmer. It's so deeply ingrained in him. He constantly evaluates the European landscape through an agricultural lens. He looks at the fields in France and Belgium, making notes on the weather, the mud. But deep down, he is just desperately longing to see the oats, the wheat, and the familiar crops of his Alban Road farm. To him, this European terrain is totally alien. He's sitting in these cold, damp tents, writing home about how much he misses the harvest back in Ohio.
To really understand what Jim was going through here, we have to talk about the military machine he was caught in. This was the replacement depot system, famously, or maybe infamously, known to GIs as the Ruppel-Duppel. See, unlike previous systems that kept units together, the U.S. Army was now basically feeding men into combat units one by one. These guys were treated as interchangeable numbers. You'd be held in these vast pools in France, Belgium, or Holland, literally just waiting for a combat division to suffer casualties, so you could be shipped out to fill the gap. It totally stripped fully trained soldiers of unit cohesion, right when they needed it the absolute most.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because, thankfully, Jim wasn't entirely alone in this massive machine. He had Harold Comm. They were both from Northwest Ohio. They met back at Camp Fannin during basic training, and get this, their serial numbers were literally just 70 digits apart. They trained together, bunked together at Fort Meade, and crossed the Atlantic side by side. Comm essentially became Jim's lifeline. Jim even wrote these comical stories home about how the two of them were almost like an old married couple. Their wives even became friends back in Ohio. In the completely faceless Ruppel-Duppel system, having your best buddy right there with you was everything.
But the Ruppel-Duppel system didn't exactly care about friendship. On October 7th, 1944, Cam's number was called for the 30th Infantry Division. Jim's wasn't. The very next day, Jim writes this genuinely heartbreaking letter, comparing the pain of losing Cam to the agony of leaving his wife and kids. Cam was almost in tears when they parted ways. And just like that, in a flash, the replacement pipeline severed the one stabilizing bond Jim had. It really proved that in this massive military machine, these men were ultimately just cogs waiting to be deployed.
On October 13th, Jim's number finally comes up. He's assigned to Company K, 3rd Battalion, 115th Regiment of the 29th Infantry Division, the famed blue and gray. But look, this wasn't some triumphant arrival. Jim was incredibly pragmatic about the whole thing. See, Company K had been nearly wiped out earlier in October during a brutal assault on the German village of Scheer-Waldenroth. So Jim is stepping into this traumatized rebuild unit in a quote-unquote peaceful sector. But peaceful just meant incredibly tense guard duty, small unit nightly patrols hoping to snatch a German prisoner, and random, terrifying artillery barrages.
Now ask yourself, beyond the physical danger, the constant mud, and the loss of his best friend, what do you think was the single biggest psychological strain on Jim during his first 2 months in Europe? Well, it was the silence. Because of how that replacement pipeline constantly shuffled men around, Jim's mail was literally chasing him across the continent. He went nearly 2 full months in a war zone without receiving a single letter from Georgette or his family. Then, finally, on November 14th, the dam breaks. 2 months of backlogged mail finally catches up to him. He writes home about it, but the tone of his letter isn't pure, unadulterated joy. It's much more of a profound, exhausted relief. It's incredibly bittersweet. Because right as he is finally reading words of love and getting updates from his farm, the massive gears of the Allied war machine are turning. This quiet, precious moment of connection happens just 2 days before his unit is thrown right into the fire.
And that fire was Operation Queen. Launched on November 16th, this was a massive, grinding Allied offensive aimed at pushing through the Rhineland all the way to the Ruhr River. The objectives were these heavily fortified German villages, and everyone knew the fighting was going to be brutal. Jim's division, the 29th, was tasked with seizing these stepping stone villages. And honestly, the tactical reality they faced was an absolute nightmare for an infantryman. And this brilliantly illustrates what they were up against. Looking at the tactical path of the 115th Infantry, you can really see the daunting task ahead. You've got Seersdorf sitting on the left and Derbeslaar on the right. Jim's unit was ordered to assault Seersdorf first. To do this, they basically had to cross vast, wide-open spaces against deeply entrenched German defenders who had literally been preparing for this exact attack. The assault on Seersdorf was a 2-day hellscape. Jim and his company had to cross an almost mile-long, completely flat farm field. They had zero cover. They had absolutely zero tank support. And the Germans, they were sitting comfortably up in the village church steeple, watching every single move, with their mortars and artillery already pre-registered and dialed in. Miraculously, they actually crossed that field. But once they got inside Seersdorf on the second day, it devolved into this brutal house-to-house, cellar-by-cellar fighting. Company K took heavy casualties, but somehow, Jim survived.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide, and honestly deeply heartbreaking, is the agonizing irony of the terrain here. If you look east toward Derbeslaar, it reveals flat, wide-open, muddy farmland. To Jim Hertzfeld, this ground looked almost exactly like the Northwest Ohio farmland he loved so much. These were the kind of fields he had been desperately longing to get back to. But here, in Germany, this familiar-looking soil was a designated kill zone. The very next day, November 19th, 1944, they had to do it all over again. They jumped off from Seersdorf to assault the next village, Derbeslaar. Once again, they had to cross those flat, muddy farm fields with almost no cover. Now, this time, they did finally have some tank support, but it just wasn't enough. At some point during this grueling advance, or maybe amidst a furious German armored counterattack later that day, Jim Hertzfeld's luck ran out. Jim was killed in action. The military bureaucracy documented his passing with this really chilling sterility. His hospital admission document simply reads, causative agent, artillery shell, blast effects. That's it. It is such a cold, mechanical end for a man whose letters just overflowed with warmth, humor, and a deep, visceral love for his family and his land. The Rebel Devil system had processed him, the tactical machine had deployed him, and the artillery had consumed him. But the shockwave of that artillery shell didn't just stop in Germany, did it? It traveled all the way back across the Atlantic to 219 East Dudley Street in Ohio. In early December, Georgette received the dreaded War Department telegram. The unimaginable had happened. But then came this completely devastating psychological twist. A few days after learning her husband was dead, the mail carrier arrived with Jim's final letter, the one he wrote on November 14th. She had to sit there and read his hopeful, loving words, knowing he was already gone. Overnight, Georgette was suddenly a widow, raising 3 little boys, all under the age of 6. She carried an immense burden, navigating this profound grief, along with some lingering tension with Jim's in-laws. Thankfully, she wasn't truly alone. Her own parents, along with her aunt and uncle, lived just a few blocks away to help her survive it. Now, Jim was initially buried in a military cemetery in Holland. However, in 1948, the U.S. government offered repatriation, and Georgette finally brought her farmer home. He was laid to rest in St. Joseph Cemetery, the exact same Catholic parish he belonged to in Maumee, Ohio. And today, he is joined there by Georgette and their sons, Tommy and Mike. Which leaves us with a heavy, lingering question to think about. When a farmer is pulled from his fields, fed into an impersonal military machine, and falls in a foreign field that looks ironically exactly like his own, what is the true generational cost? The war ended, the maps were redrawn, but for Georgette and her 3 boys, the echo of that artillery shell in Derbeslaar resonated for the rest of their lives. It's a really stark reminder that behind every sterile casualty statistic is a family left tending the soil back home. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.